Okay, so great to be back. Indeed, it was a long time ago I was here last. And that was the beginning of a long trajectory of collaborations with Jonatas, where we really were linking across, let's say, art, science, and technology. And yesterday I talked a little bit about the outcomes of those collaborations, and I focused very much on how these cross-disciplinary interactions can really open up new routes for science. Because as scientists, you know, we're often very conservative, very worried about controllability. We're worried about, you know, not embarrassing ourselves towards our colleagues, because we always have to pretend we're the smartest person in the room. So we don't take risk. We become very risk averse. You know? And I think these collaborations that go into the domain of arts help you a lot. But again, opening these possibilities of risk, of exploring, of trying, and also failing. On the other hand, if you perform, the demo effect doesn't exist. It's a funny thing that many researchers, if you visit their labs and they want to show you something, nothing works. So, oh, the demo effect. Right? It's terrible. Well, if you have to perform, you stand on stage, people paid for a ticket, and you have to show something. You cannot fail. And then you cannot stand on stage and say, well, sorry, demo effect today, folks, you can go home. All right? So we should not underestimate the pressure that exists on performers and artists to deliver. Right? So that's so yesterday was a bit the theme, and what I want to do today, hopefully with the assistance of some visual material, but I can draw it out as well. I want to talk now a little bit more about the scientific program behind that work. And what I want to focus on is very much my interest as a psychologist. I mean, I started life as a psychologist. I escaped from psychology because I felt psychology was too flaky, if you want. There were no solid foundations in psychology to be found. There was a lot of great experimental work, great statistics, methodologically, they're very astute. But then there were fundamental principles. You see, something's happening. Oh, we got it. Just push play. If you ask about basic principles, then things are difficult. So from there, then I escaped to artificial intelligence, and I worked some time in Zurich, and then I moved on to artificial intelligence, from artificial to neuroscience. I was working with Jerry Edelman for a while in San Diego. And right now what I do is really try to redefine psychology, but more from the perspective of machine-based models of mind and brain. So this really are, we also call it living machines. Okay? We have an annual conference of living machines this year in Edinburgh. So you should also submit your papers for our next edition next year, probably in the US. Location to be announced. So the work I'm talking about, of course, the product of collaborations, people, many different backgrounds, from design to physics and mathematics and so on. So it's definitely not that I'm doing all this by myself. It is all teamwork. And that's one of the things we also have to, you know, tune ourselves to better, I believe, in academia. Is how do you build a team science, right, that allows multidisciplinary interaction in the service of these big challenges we face, like mind, brain, and also consciousness. Okay? That's really what I would like to talk about today. First, I'm going to talk about how we have been building models of the system, the brain, that links it to psyche. This is a mosaic from a Roman villa expressing psyche. So how do we understand mental phenomena from this perspective of the physical brain that weighs about 1.5 kilograms and has about 90 billion neurons in it, according to the last count, by Herculano Hutzol here in Brazil. So we have a theory. The theory can be completely wrong. And that's actually also important about theories to be wrong, because then you learn something. Theories don't need to be right. You want to push theories until they break. Then you know you have to improve them. So this is my theory. It's called distributed adaptive control. And we're pushing this model forward since 1992. And DEC actually makes a number of simplifying statements about brains. Right? First, as brains are layered control systems. Okay? So that means that the brain is predicated on the body, on the soma, that provides you with sensors, effectors, and a definition, an embodied definition of self. The self will need certain nutrients, it needs to find certain conditions for survival, so the embodiment already predicates everything else that follows. Then we have reactive control, which I will also talk a bit more about later. You can see it's playing out the level of the brainstem and the midbrain, where sensor states are mapped to sensory processing, that are mapped onto the needs and drives of the self in the service of drive reduction, to speak also in terms of Hull. And this gives you behaviors, reflexive behaviors. But they're pretty darn good, you know. If you take a hamster and you decorticate them, okay, you might not like to do it, but as an experiment, behaviorally you won't notice massive differences. Okay, if they just live in cages. They will take care of their young, they will survive, and so on. So these reactive brainstem, midbrain control systems are pretty complete. But they will not be able to deal with worlds that are more unpredictable. That's when these systems start to become difficult. That's where the adaptive layer comes in. Because the adaptive layer gives you the acquisition of the state space. Right? For those of you familiar with artificial intelligence, and for instance Searle's Chinese room experiment that they actually borrowed from Leibniz in monadology, that was written 200 years earlier, it basically, look, if I'm inside the machine, right, I can perform these operations without knowing anything. Right? So how do we ground the symbols of the machine? And Leibniz made exactly the same argument. So I'll tell you that. So in the DEC theory, we solved the problem with the adaptive layer. The adaptive layer is playing out at the level of amygdala, cerebellum, hippocampus, primary sensory areas, where you basically acquire the state space of the world, the self, and action. I'll give some examples of that. Okay? This whole layer of neural processing is dedicated to state space acquisition, labeling the world. You're not born knowing what's a chair, you learn what it is. That's the adaptive layer doing its job. Okay? So once I have the state space, I can start to build policies, as the machine learning people call it. I can start to build strategies of action that are goal-oriented. Right? Because the goals I pursue are distal in the world. They're not immediately sensible. You cannot sense them directly. Right? So maybe I want to become the next king of Spain. Who knows? These are rather distal goals that will take many steps to get towards. So you will have to build strategies to reach those goals. And this all happens at the contextual layer, and we'll say a few words about it later as well. So, basically, across these layers, we have three columns. So that means we have systems and subsystems that are fully dedicated to processing states of the world, they're perceptual. Right? They take sensor data, they turn them into interpreted sensor data, so it's a percept. Right? They turn them into episodic memories. Right? It is all describing the world. Then we have similar descriptions of the self, from needs and drives to values and goals. Emotions live in this column. And then thirdly, we have a column that's all dedicated to action, like how do I organize my skeletal muscle system, the conformation and location of the body, to actually deal with interaction between the self and the world. So we have a matrix-like organization which we can look at the brain. Okay, well, we mapped out all, okay, this I described to you. Now, the difficulty of the brain is that it's organized at many different levels. And that's why for very many physicists, the brain is a difficult phenomenon to understand. Because they have developed fantastic methods to develop a homogeneous system, like spin glass systems and so on. They're organized at one or a few levels of organization that are often share a bottom-up causality. And brains are not organized like that. That's why they're so unique. Right? They have a multi-scale organization from the atomic level, the molecular level. I like chem kinase as an example. It's the structural molecule of memory, the foundational molecule of memory that interacts with the microtubules. Microtubules show properties that seem to be affected by quantum mechanical factors. And on the other hand, we live in groups, in social cultural environments, we build cities, and we give talks to each other. Right? These are all levels of organization in which brains are embedded. So, if we want to build a theory of that system, we must be able to account for all these levels and their bidirectional interaction. Right? It's not just a feed-forward, bottom-up causality that drives what we are. Okay? I also do things because I want to be nice to Jonathan, so that's not just a bottom-up causality. Right? Well, okay, depends.
That's a few.
Exactly, it's reciprocity. Okay, so how do you deal with that? So, I call our methodology convergent validation, and basically that means that you want to build models of this system in which multiple levels of descriptions converge. So that's what I'm going to show to you, right? It's really about the convergence of anatomy, physiology, and behavior, in the sense that you want these models then to be empirically adequate. Right? Models of mind and brain don't need to be true with a big T, like you can solve them and say, oh, it converges. Right? Who says the brains converge in that sense? It's about converging lines of evidence, of accounting for the data. And the better you succeed, like for instance, if a model is like fitting a curve to a cloud of data points, you know, mathematically there's an infinite set of lines you can throw through a cloud of data points. And each one you can declare to be model. So how do you select among them? How do you solve this problem of indeterminacy? It's through convergent validation. So for me, the obligation of any model of the brain, or any model that pretends to be a model of the brain, is to show how you account for anatomy, physiology, and behavior in the same model. Otherwise, it's just the beginning at best. All right? But now on top of that, I think we also bring in experience. That's why in the end, I hope we get there, I think that's a fourth factor we have to start to include. Certainly we're talking about the mammalian brain. So that means effectively we have to deal with robots, because robots give you behavior. So if you want to bring in behavior as your constraint, a little model in MATLAB doesn't behave, right? So what many people do, they show you pretty pictures. Here, I found this picture in the Journal of Neuroscience, and I made the same picture in MATLAB, and they look the same, and therefore it's a good model. It's not true. That's not a good model. It's making nice pictures. That's mimicry. It's about behavior. Right? Brains evolve to behave. I will make the argument in later. So you have to link your models to robots. Not because we like robots, it's really a nightmare to work with them because they're very brittle. But that's the only way to give a model behavior. And behavior is what it's all about. So this is now our bridge between the flesh and the mind. So if we look at the brain, so this is a little animation. Here you see the cortex, you see the cerebellum here. Here you see the thalamus in the center, hippocampus, caudate nucleus. So, going to talk about the cerebellum later. 70% of the neural volume sits here in the cerebellum. Right? So don't let size mislead you. Most neurons sit in the cerebellum. And we're going to explain that. Well, explain it, yes, we're going to parse it. But we have to look at the structure as the product of evolution. And this is confusing because we might want to think about ourselves as these chess-playing geniuses operated by logic, but we forget that brains and also ourselves, we are produced by evolution, and we might have strange biases as a result. That's why many people right now are really confused, like, oh, humans don't make optimal decisions if they have to optimize rewards. They have biases, they think they can control outcomes much more than they do, right? Well, that's a surprise and no surprise. It's only a surprise when you make the assumption we are, Homo economicus, optimizing our economic returns. We are the products of evolution. So what then are these design principles for brains? If we go from the smoky shrew here to humans, our objective is to identify the common design principles behind these brains. Are there any? Or are they all built de novo, right? What are the design principles of brains? Are there any? Well, if you look at the general layout of brains, this is a nice drawing by Swanson, sort of a generic mammalian brain, you already see that the gross structure across all these vertebrates, for instance, is rather similar. From lamprey to human, the basic layout looks anatomically rather similar. But beyond that similarity, is there more? Well, one beautiful example is provided by Nick Strausfeld and his friends. They published this paper not so long ago, where first they proved the archaeologist wrong, or the paleontologist, by showing that the organic, or the tissue, that organs can leave traces and in the fossil record. So here they found this 520 million year old fossil of this little shrimp in China. It was really hard to find because they had to split the rocks exactly in the right plane. They found this residue of the brains of these little shrimps, and they reconstructed it. And what Nick then showed is that the basic structure of this brain, here you see the optic lobes, these are the optic ganglia, here you see the antennal lobes, so the olfactory processing system. This looks a bit like mushroom bodies. But then what Nick showed is that the basic layout of this brain is similar to that of a shrimp that still happily lives in southeastern Asia, and this is widely consumed by the local population. Right? So it shows you that in sort of general terms, the layout of these brains seems to be conserved. So it's reasonable to believe there are common design principles behind brains. There are other examples. I will not go into the details too much. Stan Grillner has made a very beautiful argument about how the basic action selection circuit of the lamprey brain. The lamprey is a parasitic fish. It's also emerged in the Cambrian. It's very old. It's seen as the prototypical structure of the vertebrate brain. And what Stan argues is that the basic circuit in this brain of the lamprey that allows the animal to select action, go left, go right, got co-opted in more elaborate vertebrate brains like our own to perform action selection also in perceptual domains for attention, in memory domains for decision making. Okay? So it's basically now, this is how we can think about the evolution of the brain that is co-opting successful circuit designs into other modalities, providing new functions. Okay, this is more work from Nick Strausfeld and Klaus Hirt, where they also make an argument about homology between mammalian brains and invertebrate brains, which of course was a no-no. If you read the textbooks, like, oh no, insects, very different brains. But they show genetically, there's lots of similarity. Okay? And this is another example, in this case from Leah Krubitzer, who shows how we can think about the evolution of the neocortex as a modular design system. Okay? So it's just to show you that there are enough examples in the literature that make it reasonable to say, well, for the vertebrate brain, and maybe even all the way to the invertebrate brain, there might be common design principles. So then our question should be, what are these common design principles? This is how we look at the modeling work that we do. Okay? But now, before you embark on this, you just have to pose one of the hard questions that most neuroscientists avoid, which is, what's the function of them? If you go to the Society for Neuroscience meeting, you pose this question to your average neuroscientist, you usually giggle. You say, oh, I don't know, I studied this GABA receptor. You know. So, but I think it's important we start with the functional hypothesis. We must be willing to be wrong. There's no shame in being wrong. This is how we learn, right? So, okay, what's my functional hypothesis? Well, it goes back to Ivan Pavlov, Claude Bernard. There are some contemporary neuroscientists who are, not tendering this as their invention. It's not true. The point is, brains evolved to generate action, and action allows the calibration between the organism and its environment. That makes brains control systems. They control action. So, what does it take to act is then the next question. What's our hypothesis on that? What are the top-level objective functions that an acting system has to solve? Well, in my opinion, there are only 4. Okay? Now, the derivative of the starting point, brains evolve to act, and they act by optimizing what I call H4W. So how the action is achieved by optimizing 4 functions, which is motivation. Why? Why am I standing here? Why am I drinking coffee? Okay. So this is the self column of the deck architecture, if you want. And it's what, That means which objects in the world pertain to these motivational states. What are my objects of desire? Okay? Then it's where. What is the spatial configuration of my task? Where is this object? Where am I in this space? So the spatial structuring of my environment. I exist in space. And last is when. I also exist in time. There is dynamics I have to adapt to. My body has inertia and momentum, so has the world. I move through space, I have to change my conformation to deal with those dynamics. So these are the 4 top-level objective functions you have to optimize. So that's what we're going to do. So here you have our friend the laboratory rat in the shuttle box. It has a home base here, that means it's a position in space it returns to very frequently. Here's a feeding location, and you see the animal is basically shuttling between the home base and the feeding location. It returns with food pellets that are big, consumes them at home. You go to the supermarket, you bring it home, you eat all the stuff, well, some of the stuff you eat on your way. And others, the small pellets it eats on the spot. Okay? But you see here, right, it has a motivation, it's hungry, so why is satisfied. There's also what, well, the food pellets in this corner. Then you see where, it's the spatial structure of this task, and you see the when. You see exactly how it is changing its conformation of the body to very nicely go around these corners. So this is your existence as well in the physical world. This is all there is to explain. The physical world, let's say. So these are the 4 top-level objective functions brains have to satisfy also in our case. And that's then what the DEC theory does. Okay? So I will we have in the meantime also mapped the DEC theory to different substructures in the brain, like the reactive state space of the brainstem and the midbrain, the more adaptive layers of, for instance, hippocampus, sensory cortices, amygdala, cerebellum, and then the contextual layer that you find here in the frontal cortex and also basal ganglia. And I will highlight just one of these. To give you now an idea how we mapped these ideas to very specific predictions on the brain and how we tested these predictions, and in the end how we use that to explain consciousness. Alright, back to the brain. I want to say something just about the adaptive layer now, in particular about the cerebellum. The cerebellum is 70% of your neural volume. If you lesion the cerebellum, you have ataxia, so you will really see marked changes in motor control, right? You lose precision in motor control. On the other hand, it doesn't seem to affect, let's say, consciousness is the claim. However, there's a nice experiment on a macaque monkey where you show that perturbations on the cerebellum can affect visual illusions, suggesting again that the cerebellum might be affecting some of the temporal processing that goes on that feeds into consciousness. And actually, the cerebellum, I can describe it maybe here better. A typical role ascribed to the cerebellum is how it allows you to mediate or to balance adaptive anticipatory action with direct reactive compensatory actions. Okay? So that's what we want to look at. A typical paradigm is for this classical conditioning, where we have our rabbit, the animal of choice for these paradigms. You present it with a neutral sound, the conditioned stimulus that goes on here, right, followed by an air puff to the eye, and the nictitating membrane protects the eye. So that we see here, right? So here we have now the unconditioned response of the animal to this shock to the orbit or the air puff. Also, you see it illustrated here. And if you do it often enough, we get a so-called conditioned response. A response that is triggered by the sound itself and that starts to anticipate the onset of this noxious stimulus. So it's protecting the eye now from this noxious stimulus. We know the circuit of this structure very well. It's the eye-blink circuit of the rabbit. So on the one hand we go here from brainstem nuclei to the pontine nucleus, which is the main input pathway to the cerebellum. Mossy fibers, and mossy fibers are actually the single largest population of neurons in your brain. That's why the cerebellum contains 70% of your neural volume. It's all these granule cells. They're tiny. It has been really difficult to measure from them. It's happening rather recently when people succeed. they give rise to parallel fibers that terminate on the so-called Purkinje cells, which are beautifully arranged in a two-dimensional plane, all aligned, and these parallel fibers are cruising through them orthogonally to the plane of their dendrites. So here we have our input signal. This is the sound coming in over these parallel fibers. So now, as Pavlo already said, we should look for convergence if we want to understand these forms of learning. Well, that happens over the inferior olive, right? So we have our air puff to the eye, goes to the trigeminal nucleus, the brainstem nucleus dedicated to pain processing, inferior olive, and from there is the so-called climbing fiber, which also targets the Purkinje cells. That was convergence of our two stimuli, right? The condition, the sound, and the air puff. Climbing fibers are not like parallel fibers, they're very specific, okay? So they're very monogamous, they like one cell, they stick to it. Alright, so they target one cell, they make many synapses with it. There's a collateral to the interpositus nucleus. So what happens now? Convergence on the Purkinje cell. Now the output from the Purkinje cell goes to this interpositus nucleus, or the deep cerebellar nuclei, and from there we go back out to the red nucleus, it's a motor nucleus, the facial nucleus, and now we hit the nictitating membrane and we can close it. And the beauty is, this circuit is repeated about 50 million times in our cerebellum. Okay? So that's why people call it crystalline, it's very well defined. Okay? So we know how these circuits are organized anatomically. So they have been modeled by people like Marr and Albus that thought about these systems as associative learning systems. And also what Marr already observed is that you can think about the climbing fiber signal here as an error signal. Right? It reflects an error in the detection of a noxious stimulus. And that should control the learning. So this is the typical physiology of this system. So here what we see is that, let's say the response of the Purkinje cell, right, to, this is a trained animal, okay? You see that the response of the Purkinje cell to a trained stimulus is that it stops to fire, which might seem surprising. Okay? And why is that? Well, the output of the Purkinje cell is inhibitory. And the interpositus nuclei, these neurons have a rebound polarization if they're released from inhibition. So you stop the inhibition, then it's fine. So they rebound. And that's why you have an acquired pause in the response. That's the idea of these Purkinje cells. We model this from the perspective of control. And the one element we emphasize here is very much this negative feedback that exists in the circuit. If the cerebellum generates an output, or the Purkinje cell generates an output that goes down to the motor nuclei, there's a collateral going to this inferior olive that generates the error signal. Right? So the output is controlling the error signal itself. And the question is, okay, is this now helping you to balance your reactive reflex to the stimulus with an anticipatory component? Right? So this is then the model that we built. So let's look at how it works on the robot. So basically here we generalize this idea of control with the idea that the cerebellar control circuit is helping you to balance the contribution of a reflexive response and an acquired response. So here the conditioned stimulus, the sound, are these stripes that are being detected by the robot. The collision it detects here is the unconditioned stimulus, it's the air puff or the shock. And now the question is, can the robot acquire or optimize its trajectory so that it avoids these collisions, pursuing a minimal trajectory? Okay, so now here you see how these signals come. Here we detect the conditioned stimulus. Here we get the anticipated in white conditioned response, and here in red the unconditioned response. And the overall behavior you get is now a mixture of these two components. So I just wanted to go through this in a bit more detail to give you an idea of how we realize this idea of convergent validation in models of the brain. Right? So we say, okay, adaptive layer is state-space acquisition. In this case, you learn states that relate to your motor control, it's action states. Okay, then we model these in circuits that reflect the basic anatomy and physiology of that circuit, as I sketched out to you, and we test it on the robot, so we have behavior. This is the overall approach. So, if we now go a step up, I mean, this psychedelic slide, what I try to reflect visually is how decision making is done in this model. Okay? We're not going to worry about the details of that now. I just want to worry about one of the key assumptions we made. Okay? Basically, we have our agent performing its actions that are accumulated in a short-term memory buffer. But the fundamental assumption we make here is that the representational primitives of these systems are conjunctive representations. That means in one representation you merge together sensory motor states. Okay, this is the fundamental assumption we make. And from these conjunctive short-term memory representations you form action policies. That basically means this sequence of sensory motor states will lead me to this goal. And then you can show that if you follow this approach, that it is optimal in a Bayesian sense. This is based also on the work by Domassaro, who actually brought this to the fore originally, or in the 80s, that Bayesian inference is like a fundamental organizing principle of brains. And by now you know that predictive brain is like hyper-popular. If you don't say Bayesian, the brain, you're out of fashion. But everybody forgot it starts with Domassaro. But what we showed with our decision-making model is that to get optimal decision-making in this model, in a foraging task, robots that try to forage for food, like the rat in the shuttle box, you need a 4-factor decision-making model. Okay? Which basically means you have to combine perceptual evidence with memory bias, with goal information and value. Alright? So this is a way to get optimal behavior, that we showed how this also gives rise to unexpected feedback, but the key thing now is optimality was predicated on conjunctive representation. That seemed an extremely strong assumption. Alright? So now we go to the next step. Right? So first I explained, if you want, with our model, how the cerebellum allows you to shape the state space of actions. Right? And I brought together physiology, anatomy, and behavior. Now I go to the next step. Every good model has to make predictions. First I explain something, but now I have to predict stuff. Well, what's our prediction? Well, somewhere in the brain, some system is building conjunctive representations, chunking together sensory motor states, and feeding those into decision-making models. Is that the case? So, well, we went to look at the hippocampus. Hippocampus is this beautiful structure like 2 small bananas. Here your medial temporal lobe, you see them here. But again, a very prototypical circuit structure. Okay? So input goes in over the perforant path here from the entorhinal cortex. That's the input stage. Then it goes to the dentate gyrus. From there, dentate gyrus, it goes to what's called CA3. CA3 is like the main memory system here. And from there it flows to the cornus harmonis 1, CA1, which you can consider like a readout stage of the main memory system. And those projections go back out into the cortex. Right. So this is a fundamental memory system. Also Michael talked about it yesterday. If you lesion it, you cannot form episodic memories anymore. And this talk will be new to you every day. So we modeled all these components of that on previous occasions. Here are the famous grid cells in the medial anterional cortex you might have heard of. Grid cells were discovered by Edward and Maybrit Moser. And grid cells have a very particular response to movement in space. It's a grid-like, this is like the response field of a single neuron that will give you very regular responses that are tessellated in a very specific way in space. So this is really X and Y. Okay? And these are the examples of 3 different neurons. We modeled this very well back. The lateral anterional cortex, however, so we're talking cortex here, is not structured in that way. The lateral anterional cortex gives responses to features in space. Colors, objects, and whatever. Much more tied to stimuli. And now, what John Listman suggested is that, well, here you have the 2 components of a conjunctive representation. The grid cells tell you about your movements in space, action. The lateral anterional cortex tells you about sensory states. So, question, is the hippocampus now merging these two streams of inputs into one representation? So, multiplexing action and sensory states. So here you see how we model it on a robot. With the robot going around, here you see the grid cells of the anterional cortex. Here you see the place of actually this work done by Andrea Luprisotto and Cesar Reina Costa, who also came here from NICS, who have done extremely well. They came from this university, exactly, done extremely well. Great students, so you should set more of them.
Yeah, the video there in the video.
So, with these now basic ingredients in hand, then the question becomes, okay, can we explain these conjunctive representations? Okay? So that was the idea of John Listman. He wrote in a nice paper like, okay, we have what, we have where, and how coming in of a lateral and medial anterional cortex, two input streams. Is the dentate gyrus now merging these guys together? Is that multiplexing sensory states and action? And the phenomenon we tried to explain with that is what's called rate remapping. It was reported by Lloyd-Gap, it was also in the Moser lab, and it was a very curious phenomenon because they were measuring from this hippocampal system at the input stage dentate gyrus and at the memory stage CA3. So here we see dentate in green and CA3 in purple. And then they did something really, really smart because they slowly changed the environment. Now, up till that point, there was this belief, look, the hippocampus is essentially committed to space. Like the GPS of the brain, as people called it when O'Keefe and the Moses got the Nobel Prize in 2014. So if I morph the environment, if the environment, the sensory appearance of the environment changes, you would predict that these responses should not be affected too much. It's a GPS system, X, Y stays the same. Right? But what they observed is they actually have a very specific degradation of the population vector. What does it mean? Well, they would just go in these structures, measure from a bunch of neurons, and consider that one vector of responses. And they would change the environment and measure the same vector again, and just do the correlation between them. Okay, so great. Is the response of these neurons changing? And as you can see, at the population level, it is. If you change the environment from 1 and 2 to, let's say, 1 and 7 here, so here we have rectangular and circular, there is a rather strong degradation of this correlation. So this would directly suggest that there's something else being integrated here than just location XY. So is that now sensory space? So we modeled this in great detail. We brought in all the known anatomy, physiology, convergence, divergence, and so on. And we could explain this, this effect when you have a mixing factor of 0.3. That means if 70% of the information to the memory system is action related and 30% is perception related, you can exactly account for this degradation of the population vector. Okay? So there you go. The Mosers then tested this idea by lesioning the lateral anterional cortex after we did our modeling study. Okay, then they showed that if you lesion the lateral anterional cortex, then this degradation of the population vector is reduced. Okay, so this confirmed now the subsequent prediction. Right, so here you go. This is Andre, this is Cesar. Here we performed with our band in Razzmatazz, one of the main concert podia in Barcelona. He's a great guitar player. So the DEC model made a prediction. We had optimal decision making when we operate on conjunctive representations. Right? With that, we went back to the brain. Okay, this is now our prediction. Does it hold? We found evidence for that in the hippocampus explaining rate remapping. And then the Mosers followed up by lesioning lateral anterional cortex, confirming what we predicted. Right? So we have now predicted and we have explained. So let's now go to the next prediction that also will bring us closer to our story on consciousness, but I'm not sure how well we're doing time-wise. You
have more half an hour.
Oh, great. Okay. So,
25 minutes.
okay, so here we have a rat. This is a movie from Dave Radish and Matt Vandermeer. This animal is shuttling in a T-maze. Right? It starts here, and let's go left or right, and then it gets reward in one of these two arms. Okay? And all the lights that you see on its head are tied to the electrodes that are in its brain, measuring from its hippocampus. Okay? Now, you see this animal sort of makes decisions. But if you look at the details of it, the actual shape of behavior is very changing in a very subtle way across these labs. Yeah? So let's look here at lab 4. You see what happens? In lab 4, the animal is looking around. Okay? So now, let's look at this again. So now look at how, in lab 1, it just is ballistic, it goes somewhere. Right? Lab 2, same deal. Not much hesitation. Okay? Lab 3, but now wait for lab 4. It looks around. And that makes a decision. Okay? So, and then after it has done that, it again goes to a more ballistic style of movement where it seems to know where it's going. Okay? So, this behavior is called vicarious trial and error and was first described by Tolman in the 30s. And how he described it, or he called this vicarious trial and error, he said, well, it's as if the rat is imagining the solution to the task. Right? So it's like performing mental time travel. It's imagining what it has to do. And indeed, Johnson and Radish, in about 10 years ago, published this really beautiful study where they gave rather direct evidence for that. So here we have an animal in a similar situation. The circle is the location of the animal. And all the blinking little rectangles are the predicted positions derived from the responses of these place cells. Remember the hippocampus, we have cells that like locations in space, x, y. So if a cell is active, you can say, well, that cell believes we're in x, y. Okay? So that's now what we project. So here when the animal stands still at this decision point, you see a sweep in one direction of the arm of the maze and in the other direction of the maze. Right? So this VTE behavior, when it looks around, is accompanied by very well orchestrated activity in this memory system. That is mental time traveling. It is probing the task mentally. Okay? Which is absolutely fantastic. So this is now what we have to explain. So for that, we built a robot model of mental time travel. So here we have our robot performing sort of the same task. It's naive, it has no clue what it is doing. So it's inspecting the space, it performs VTE, and then it selects its actions. Okay? So we model this now also in our robot. How does this work? So we took our whole deck architecture, we took our detailed hippocampal model I just described to you, the detailed cerebellum model, we have a detailed prefrontal cortex, we have a bunch of other strobasal ganglia, ventral tegmental area, spiracolliculus, trigeminal nucleus, hypothalamus, linked to this robot. You have now an idea a little of the complexity and accuracy of these two boxes in this diagram. And now the question, okay, the robot is performing the same task as this rat in the maze. So here you see an early naive trial in blue, and then this is the home base. These are the different rewards it has to pick up with its gripper. These are different landmarks or obstacles it has to avoid. So with time it's shuttling, it likes the red ones, so it's shuttling between the home base and the red targets and brings them home. Yep. And now, what we can do, we can now analyze the dynamics of this behavior. So here we have the robot going around, it has 3 different positions. It sees something red, something green, and something yellow. Here we can look at the responses of its memory system that gives you these place cells. Here I have one example of such a place cell. And at the population level, they look rather different. But also I can see here how this robot is, when it does the VTE, is performing a similar kind of sweep as we see here in the Johnson and Radish case, the robot's in this location, okay, in the first panel. And then from there, activity is projected into this memory system. And dependent on the lateral connectivity, this memory system now also are feeling out, mentally if you want, future positions. These positions are actually feeding back these positions that is reading out in this hippocampal memory system is feeding back in the decision-making system. So that it can assess online what's the expected return or reward, what's the expected reward when I will go in this direction or that direction. Right? So the mental time travel playing out in the hippocampus allows you to assess the value of the different potential policies you can execute, and these are then feeding back in the hippocampus. And there's a lot of interesting neurophysiology being provided now on this recurrent interaction between the memory system and the decision-making system. Okay? So we came a long way. But this now raises this important question, or the next question. Mental time travel, right? The rat is now experiencing, if you want, something that is not physically there. It's imagining something. So how should we think about this kind of internal simulation? How does it relate to goal achievement? How does it relate to a form of consciousness? Okay, so this is now the second part I want to get to, is how can we think of the experience that goes along with this type of mental time travel? Why would that be conscious? Why would it even exist? Okay. So, this was an early sketch on consciousness, and I want to just make a fundamental observation here about evolution. So here we see a graph of, let's say, the volume of life forms on planet Earth over time, right, from 2 billion years ago till about now. And as you're well aware, about 500 million years ago, something really strange happened. I remember here that the little shrimp we looked at lived at this time, the lamprey emerged here, okay? So suddenly, in about 50 to 100 million years, all basic body plans we know today emerged. Which means, of course, together with their brains, they co-evolved, right? Not just yet the body of a lamprey, but it was still controlled by a bacteria, right? So these things co-evolved. So the Cambrian was a very special moment. And I think it tells us something also key about these objective functions that brains have to solve. And this is for me the stepping stone to consciousness. Because who emerged? Okay? Before this time, the most complex life form on Earth was like a little worm. Right? And worms are happily digging in the ground. They're not very social, and the last time you talk to a worm, they don't say very much back. Okay? So they are in direct touch with the physical world. They are at the end of optimizing H4W. They're really good at it. Okay? Here something else happened. Now complex predator-prey systems emerged. Right? Now you have to deal with conspecifics. Social structures emerge. So I have to now add another objective function, which is who. And who, or Dr. Who, H5W, is actually a game changer. It's a dramatic change of how we can survive in the world. Okay? Because if we would treat each other just as physical objects, like bricks, our society would collapse very rapidly. Okay? Because each of us, also in this room, is pursuing and optimizing our own H4W. But you're not advertising that to me, right? I don't know how bored you are what I'm telling you. Because you're all well-educated people, and you shouldn't be yawning here and so on, right? Key thing here is, agents are driven by hidden states. Their intentions are not advertised to you. Right? I have a massive problem now. How the hell can I survive in a world that is not signaling to me what it's up to? That was the game changer. So now, what I have to do, for me in the corner here, I have to simulate my world. I have to virtualize my world. I have to infer what your internal states are. So I infer that you're damn interested in what I'm telling you. Yeah? But but I have no evidence for that. So, this is the game changer. Sorry? Exactly. So that's the game changer, right? And I'm claiming, and that also feeds into the conscious story, this leads also to the design of brains that is qualitatively different. This leads to designs of brains that are the way we know them now in vertebrates and mammals and also many social insects. So here we have a little robot that is learning to speak. And it's actually, this robot is completely amazing. It is really, this is now state of the art. And you don't know how trivial it looks, because basically Maxime here is asking the robot, what am I doing? Okay? And it's saying, you're pushing the brain with your left hand. And the point is, the robot learned to say this. We didn't pre-program that. It had to learn left hand, it had to learn brain, it had to learn pushing. Okay? So this is a robot that's learning language, it's learning very simple grammatical structure. It's worked also together with Peter Domini, who is also from Michael's school. But, so, for this robot to figure out that Maxime is pushing something with his left hand, it takes a complex, invariant representation of action. So this is roughly how we're trying to understand this at the robot level, but at the theoretical level, we're way beyond this point. Okay? So we map back to the social robot. So let's now look at this H5W problem from the perspective of consciousness, because my claim is that consciousness was the enabling factor for the Cambrian explosion. So you can disagree with me, it's a bold claim, but I think it's a reasonable one. Okay, so let's investigate this claim. But let's first look a little bit at some of the hurdles we have to take. Okay, the study of consciousness is of course complicated, there are no definitions, and there are lots of dogmas. Okay? And there are lots of dogmas that prevent us from really looking at it as a scientific question. And one of these dogmas is the so-called heart problem that people like Chalmers and Levine have advanced, that they say, well, since Nagel, his famous paper, What's It Like to Be a Bat? So consciousness, the experience of conscious qualities, you have to explain what it's like to be and experiencing something. And Chalmers said, well, this can never be part of our scientific story. Right? Actually, the discovery of the so-called heart problem happened about 100 years before Chalmers was even talking about it, by Émile Dubois-Reymond, who actually identifies this problem exactly by saying, look, how can I experience while I'm the product of a physical system? Right? How can I look at experience from this physical perspective? Chalmers never refers to Dubois-Reymond, of course, because science right now survives. Scientists get tenure, but always invent a new thing in the face of amnesia, saying, well, whatever happened 5 years ago, I have forgotten, so this is now new, right? But they just don't know their history. However, the heart problem follows actually a very simple syllogism, which is science advances third-person descriptions of phenomena. That's a typical definition of science. It's third-person, verifiable, right? We can describe the world, I can exchange these descriptions with you, you can test them yourself. Then they say, well, consciousness is first-person definition. Therefore, cannot be described by science. So, I think what we have to look at now, is it really true that we have no third-person access to experience? So it's one of the things we want to solve. And to me, it's a pure methodological question. It doesn't preclude us pursuing questions around consciousness from a scientific perspective. The only question is, do we have third-person access to first-person states? And I believe it is the case. I will show you later why. Actually, there's a much broader issue that it's not only conscious states, it's also potentially conscious states that face that problem. Any memory that you build is first person, even if it's never experienced again. Right? So what they discover with the heart problem is what people really talked about more than 100 years ago, like Brentano, right? Mental states are intentional. They are first person. It's a fundamental problem of understanding mind. It's not unique to consciousness. Right? There are two approaches towards the study of consciousness. One goes back to Francis Crick, the neural correlate of consciousness, where can we find states of the brain that correlate with states of consciousness, and then as soon as we collect enough of these correlations, then we might be able to discern a pattern. And then we have Jerry Edelman, who had a more theory-based approach. Jerry would say, well, let's start from a theory, and we test the theory with respect to consciousness. I worked with Jerry Edelman initially 2 years, and then later with Sol, where I also met with Francis Crick. Yes, okay. So now, if you look at the main theories of consciousness, we can discern 6 common themes. Okay? So the field looks complex, it's not so complex. Okay? A number of theories, Metzinger to the Master, it's all about the physically instantiated self. Okay, that's the core. Okay, I give examples of that, but we skip that. Second, sensor-motor coupling. Experience is defined by the direct, law-like sensor-motor coupling between the experiencer and the world. That's Kevin O'Regan, mainly. Okay? Then we have predictions. Certainly now, with the predictive brain hype, right? Predictions are extremely popular. It started with Gary Haslow, who actually withdrew from that. Björn Merker, but also Neil Seth, Carl Friston, Andy Clark, predictions, everything. Which is actually a very naive position, because if you go from the spinal cord to your frontal cortex, every circuit is predicting something. So it's not that it is predicting. You have to explain why the specific form the prediction takes is relevant. But that's another discussion. I had some examples of that. Then Jerry Edelman and Julian Tononi emphasized this idea of differentiation and integration, which is basically every conscious state is integrated. Right? I experience a coherent world in which you are present. But this experience is also differentiated from any other experience. And lastly, then we have Julio translated that in his famous phi measure of integration. It's an information theoretical measure that I think is a nice quantification of physiological states, but I don't think it's necessarily coupled to consciousness. We can talk about it later. And then in parallel to differentiation and integration, people like Bernie Bars and Stan de Haan and Jean-Pierre Jean-Jeu have mapped this idea to what they call the global workspace. So you basically say, well, it's like a neural interpretation of the integrated states of consciousness. Means the brain can be seen, or certainly the cortex is a bunch of processors, each doing their own thing. And then some of these processors couple together because they're dominant at a point in time. That defines your experience. Okay? So I call this the grounded and active predictive experience framework of consciousness, which summarizes the main perspectives, and as far as I'm concerned, any theory of consciousness should account for all 5 of these, not only one. So we have our unified conscious scene, as also Jerry Edelman for instance emphasized, but another perspective on that is that consciousness has levels and content. Right? So there's a content to consciousness and awareness, but also there are levels of consciousness as you go from coma and sleep to wakefulness and alertness. Okay? So how can we account for that? So if you now go to the brain, there are some very concrete pointers to how we can think about these first aspects of consciousness, content and level. Okay? So Björn Merker, for instance, talks about the core behavior systems of the midbrain, and then he's talking here in particular about the hypothalamus, the self, right, that measures states of self, and that tries to trigger action. The superior colliculus, states of the orienting towards the world, states of the world. And then for Björn Merker, it's a zona incerta. That is like an area that is mediating between these two regions. Right? So Björn, looking at hydrocephalic kids, is making the point, this is like a system of primary consciousness. It's for direct experience that is not really expanded in space and time. Okay? If you lesion these structures, they're rather devastating for your existence. In parallel to that, if you talk about the level of consciousness, alertness, coma, sleep, and so on, we have the brain activating systems of the brainstem and midbrain that are very close to these core behavior systems that are neuromodulatory. Right? They secrete acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, histamine, and other neuromodulators across the thalamus and the neocortex. And if you turn off these systems, like the reticular formation, cholinergic projections, basically you fall asleep. So a lot of anesthesia is interfering with the effect of these neuromodulators or mimicking their effects. So this is one perspective of how these brain activating systems are controlling the level of consciousness, and that these core behavior systems are defining a first order form of content, of awareness. However, we can disrupt the system with drugs. This is, for instance, ketamine. I used ketamine in an experiment and I got completely psychotic. It's not very pleasant, but it's a useful experience if you're interested in consciousness. So I recommend it to you, but do it in some supervised way. And what ketamine actually shows, and the main effect of these kind of pharmacological manipulations of consciousness have to do with the interaction between the thalamus and the cortex. The thalamus and the cortex are two recurrently coupled systems in the brain, and most drugs that affect states of consciousness affect that interaction between these two systems. Then we can look at hemispatial neglect. So we do a lot of work in stroke. Here we have a stroke patient with hemispatial neglect, and you ask him, can you please fill out this piece of paper with crosses? Okay? And then what you see is something that's very asymmetric. Then we ask these people to, in a display, detect the distractors. Okay, so here this is a distractor in the local case. This would be a distractor in the global case. Okay, this is an illusory contour, and here we mix them together. And then you measure their accuracy and reaction time. And you see that there's a very marked difference in right hemisphere patients, as this one here, in the detection and the reaction time of these illusory contours and distractors as compared to controls, or where people have lesions to the left hemisphere. Okay? So, but on top of that, if you then ask them, well, you missed these targets, don't you see it? That's also the famous phenomenon of blindsight. They would really insist that they have access to their full visual working space. So there's a denial, that's always called neglect, of missing information. So this shows, it emphasizes that you have the unitary, integrated form of conscious experience and its autonomy. But now, oh wait, there was one element we have to now put in the puzzle. These kinds of patients now suffer largely from lesions to the interaction between the parietal areas in the cortex and the frontal areas of the cortex. There are main fiber bundles running from front to back, and many of these patients have lesions, so these are stroke patients, and they have lesions to these fiber bundles. Okay, so that means that in our puzzle, the circuit diagram we're building on consciousness, we have to include these frontal parietal networks. But this unified scene actually has some weird properties, right? It's delayed. Libet did some beautiful experiments that were published in the 80s, where he asked people to look at the clock, indicated here, and they were free to just push a button when they decided to move, or when they would really push the button. They were just asked to report that. Okay? And he would measure the readiness potential over their motor cortex. This correlates with your physical action. And then what he showed is that this readiness potential, the brain's response to pushing the button, preceded with up to 300 to 500 milliseconds the reported wish to move. So from there came in this whole question now, what's consciousness really doing when it is delayed relative to physical action? And this also led people to say, well, therefore, consciousness is just an epiphenomenon. It's not causing action. We don't need it. It's like a leftover from something. All right? And then from that, you have all these arguments boiling up about how free will was an illusion and so on. So this is now the problem we got to solve. We have a unified visual scene, a conscious experience that's delayed relative to our real-time performance. So why is that? Well, it exactly fits to solving the H5W problem. This is my hypothesis. Okay? So, in order to deal with the real world that is filled with intentionality, like in this room, right, I have to now in parallel simulate all of you. I don't know who's going to be the serial killer here, right? So to defend myself, I have to simulate the hell out of all of you. So I must parallelize. I must parallelize my operations. Okay? I have to run parallel simulations of all of you. I have to virtualize, because I'm ascribing properties to you, I'm inferring properties to you that might not be there. I cannot see them, there's no physical evidence. I get no signals that tell me that Jonathan is getting stressed and I'm taking too much time. And then I have to evaluate. That means I have to, for instance, now adjust, like Jonathan is giving these implicit signals, like hurry up, and no, we have to finish, we've no time. So I have to now translate that into action. I have to turn it into value for action, like talk shouldn't take too long. All right. And this is exactly why you have a delayed conscious seeing. So that means consciousness allows you to again unify this operation and extract this value. And let me show you why this is a problem we got to solve. This is a neuroprosthetic we built for the cerebellum. Okay? We implanted it in rats. We can replace these idling conditioning circuits. Already published a while back. If I want to, and these chips are really tiny as you know, but if I want to rebuild a human cerebellum, 15 million circuits, the stack of chips is 150 kilometers tall. So it gives you an idea of the complexity of the control problem you got to solve. If any of those circuits make a mistake, how do I find it? How do I optimize it? So if parallelization creates a whole new credit assignment problem. It's not only optimizing a single objective function, no, there are 15 million I have to deal with. Yeah? So parallelization that I'm forced to engage in to deal with H5W creates a new problem of credit assignment. And I'm saying that's where consciousness comes in, because I must monitor my world, I must evaluate, and I must then reproject these evaluations to my parallel controllers. And that's exactly what consciousness is doing. Okay? So it basically means real-time action is parallel, but to optimize my real-time action in the social world, I have to monitor, right? I have to sequentialize, I have to match it to my singular goal states, extract value, and project it back to parallel control. So this is now the idea. Right? So I extract from my internal models value that I then use again to project back to my neuromodulatory systems that control learning in the system. So can we test this? So we tested this idea, so we built models, and the first thing we tested is, can the conscious seeing that runs inside this thalamocortical transient memory system really be decoupled from real-time operations? Can you dynamically couple and uncouple? Because I claim it's an autonomous transient memory. That means it can operate independent of the actual signals going on. So for that we built a psychophysical task. It's this one. So people were asked to track these linear moving objects, and once in a while one displaces. You have to push a button. And we also measure eye movement. Okay? In the meantime, people have a secondary task where we have cognitive load. People have to recite the alphabet backwards or forwards and skip X many letters and so on. The question being, if your conscious task is dealing with the alphabet, if that load goes up, at some point you will start to decouple the visual tracking of these objects. Okay? So in the test here, what's the idea of the validation gate? Basically means, look, I have internal models of these moving dots. Around these predicted trajectories, I put, if you want, bubbles. This is my validation gate. Data within the bubble, I ignore. Data outside of the bubble I have to deal with. It's a surprise. Okay? And the prediction is then, under increased cognitive load, the bubble for conscious detections of displacements will expand a lot. You will ignore more and more and more data because the conscious system is decoupling. It has another task to perform. So, this is a Tavius reverse correlation. Basically, if you push the button, we then calculate the kernels that predict, okay, this is the area in which you need displacement for you to push the button or move your eyes. Okay? And basically, you can look at the difference in these kernels, high cognitive load, low cognitive load, and you see that for the button presses, high cognitive expands tremendously. It really means the conscious decision-making system is decoupling incrementally from the signal-based task. So that shows that this system can be considered an autonomous memory system. Yeah? Then we went to fMRI. We performed the same experiment in fMRI, and here I show you the network that is active in the brain of these dozen subjects when they had explicit detections. Okay? When they really pushed the button. What's the network that's now supporting the conscious task of pushing buttons? And there we see very strong engagement again of this frontal parietal network. Okay? So this confirms what I was predicting when we analyzed the neglect patient, that the substrate of this transient autonomous memory resides in the thalamocortical frontoparietal network. Okay, this is how we have been testing this idea. So the hard problem, I think, is not such a hard problem, it's just a red herring. We can deal with it. I also showed you that in the mind travel example of the robot, I can actually completely interpret the subjective state of the robot. So with that, I call this qualiparsing. That means I can interpret these subjective states as long as I have full access to the interaction history. Because with that, I can interpret semantically every state of the system. So the hard problem can be solved as long as you have access to time. Now, for biological systems, that's hard, but for synthetic systems I built, robots, it's easy. Okay, so qualiparsing with synthetic systems is a methodology to make these first-person states accessible. If the model follows convergent validation, physiology, anatomy, behavior, it gives you also access to human-like states if that robot is an anthropomorphic robot exposed to human-like tasks. Okay, so this will be the solution to the hard problem. Using happy robots. Okay, so we've generalized it also then to rehabilitation. I also showed you this yesterday. We're not going to talk about that, but let's stop with this little video. So that's what we're going to now. Qualiparsing is a solution, but I need a synthetic system that is human-like if I like to get to human-level experience. So this is Alberto. He's very sad, and we basically have our humanoid robot now linked up with the model of the human connectome. The human connectome is a rather most accurate description of the whole brain or the whole neocortex dynamics and structure. So basically we map this connectome model and sensory motor areas to the sensory motor systems of this robot. So now we are in a position realize this convergent validation approach in the domain of complex human social actions that would allow us to do qualiparsing at a human level. That's where we're going. Okay? It was quite a story. I first elaborated a bit the DEC model, which you look at mind and brain. I talked about convergent validation, the basic layering of the brain. I showed you how we can explain and predict, which should be the mission of any theory that takes itself serious. You must explain and predict. If you don't do that, don't waste our time. And control. Control a robot to get to behavior. There's no way around it. Or control an experiment. You must have impact in the real world. Words is not enough. Words doesn't get us in the future or have impact in the clinic. Fix a brain that is broken. That's our mission. Okay, so then from there we move to consciousness, where I showed you that in my view, it's this transition in the Cambrian, where we had to deal with multi-agent systems and the demands on survival that imposed, that required consciousness to solve this new credit assignment problem that emerged from parallel operations. With that consciousness, that would be the enabler of the Cambrian explosion, because it allowed these multi-agent systems to find stability or metastable states. So then I compare that to the grounded and active predictive experience model, which summarizes most of the literature on consciousness. I think all these models at best capture the necessary conditions of consciousness, not the sufficient ones. And then I translated that to a testable hypothesis around the validation gate, where I also showed you that this core frontal parietal system also popped out in the task where we really were manipulating the coupling of consciousness to subconscious tracking in this displacement task. Right? So we're again here moving towards testing predictions. It's the same cycle we're going through. And linking to the hemispatial neglect patients, also now we work with implanted epilepsy patients. We are testing these predictions in the human brain. And then at the machine end, I think the future of that is that if we want to have machines that are able to extract the norms of their interaction with us humans, we must endow them with consciousness as I described. I think the only way to embed machines in society is to make them social, but if you want to make these machines social, they also have to be moral. That will be our technical, but also our, if you want, ethical challenge for the coming years. So thank you very much. If you have questions, here I am.
Really, we are a little bit late. Let's
Really?
do that. Yes.
I'm trying to be efficient.
If you don't mind, let's have a 10-minute session, and we're not going to have a break. And after this 10-minute session, we go straight to Michael. Okay? And we still, and I would like to stay here until noon. Okay?
We start with questions now.
Yes.
Yeah.
For Paul.
Yeah. I have a question. It seems to me that in your theory of consciousness, the issue of theory of mind is central in this question. My point is, do you think that consciousness could be, in some sense, a kind of a reflection on the theory of mind that I try to find in other beings? So imagine that you are a system, that you are looking at the world, and you're trying to detect conscious beings in the world. And at some point, you just find that, okay, well, there is a being here, and I try to focus in
It's a bit like Mike Graziano, no?
Yeah.
Have you read Mike Graziano's work on consciousness?
Microchannels?
Mike Graziano.
Ah, Mike Graziano. Oh, no.
Okay, so this is, I think, very much Mike's point. He published a book about 2 years ago on this. Where he says, look, consciousness is the following. First, we have an operational necessity to do intention reading or theory of mind on others by interpreting their attentional movements. Right? So I see Jonathan is watching his watch or his clock, so this informs me about his attentional state. And then Mike says, the same way I ascribe these intentional states to Jonathan, being nervous about time management, I can ascribe the same properties to myself. Right? This is roughly what you're saying. Yeah? And I think it's not enough, because also in Mike's theory, there are two problems in my opinion. First, this attentional aspect is at best the social perception part of the story. Right? And I'm saying you have to solve the credit assignment problem. This is only at the beginning of that pipeline. Right? You have to optimize all these parallel loops. Right? So I really try to look at it as a control problem. Right? Which fits again with the original definition of why brains evolved, control action. Right? So Mike at best is saying, or also Chris Fritz and others who have this more, let's say, consciousness serving social cognition, mind reading and so on, they sit at the front end of the pipeline, so it's incomplete in that sense. And the second problem Mike is facing, and I asked him this and he has no answer, as far as I'm concerned, how does this ascription to the self really happen? If I can understand or share, I read your attention and so on, but how does this ascription to self exactly play out at a mechanistic level? There's no explanation. And that's, I think, something you must be able to explain. These are the two challenges in that area. And I think it's incomplete. I think the real problem is a control problem. Yeah.
I'd like to know your experience with robots.
Yeah.
You succeed in the problem of but any kind of intentionality.
Mhm.
Do you?
Yes, because the robot, and if you take the Brownian sense of intentionality, to be oriented towards the outside world, right? The robot, like the robot you saw there shuttling about and collecting objects, it has these internal goals. It says, look, I really love the red objects now. It goes out to find them and collects them. So it has an internal representation of then these distal goals that it pursues. So it is, in that same way, oriented to the outside world, grounded in its embodiment, right? Because we have this whole self column in the control structure that is tied to its internal state. Not that I have defined arbitrary rules in that sense. The robot is switching between different internal drives. Internal drives are coupled to external states of the world that it then will pursue. So I would claim, yes, this is a completely reasonable approximation of an intentional state. These robots, though, don't experience that intentional state. We don't have.
There is too much information for my brain.
Like clouds.
Yeah. Relax it, like cloud.
Exactly.
And suppose that you have very smart rat or mouse,
Plenty of
and you have a kind of channel
Yeah.
and a bifurcation, but there's no keywords from left or right for it. My question is, if you repeat the experience to the rat, this decides to left or right, no keywords, left or right, 1 billion times. How many
Won't do it.
times do you think that you go to right or left?
No, the rat will go on strike, like your students here.
Or what?
The rat will go on strike, like your students here.
Oh yeah?
Oh, yeah.
No, but suppose that I
They
think
are intentional agents that are driven by their own objectives. Human experimenters try to capture those internal objectives, but if the animal doesn't get reward, it will stop.
yes.
So there's no way to run a billion of those.
Different rats, but the experience, suppose that the rats are the same rat.
I take 1 billion rats,
Yeah.
and they run the same teammates.
My question
You want to know
is,
the distribution of choices?
yeah, I go straight to the point.
Yeah.
But if you put a reward on the right, you make something like the physicists call the break the symmetry. So you have something very symmetric. So when you break the symmetry,
Yeah.
the physical systems tend to choose one of the positions for right or left.
Yeah.
So my question is, it seems to me that you try to have a kind of mechanical model for that's why I use a robot to mimic some part. So it's mechanical. But don't you think that there is a component that escapes from the classical mechanics to another?
Yes, memory. 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 We are vessels of memory. So is the rat. And that's why physicists don't understand these systems.
Yeah. Be more clear. No, that's the thing. I don't have time to think about memory. You are saying that memory. Okay, I believe it. But
No, but
for a while, I can do it.
The point is, the behavior of the animal, of you, of me, is caused by the memory of our previous experiences. It's not caused anymore by
Yes,
just a
but-
mechanical structure that you're looking at.
But if you don't break the symmetry, the position for the rat will be the same.
No, but
I mean,
but no,
50% for left.
no, but you treat the rat like a billiard ball. It's not. Okay, so these animals come equipped like you.
No, as a
with-
single
with-
mechanical.
No, but they come pre-equipped with exploration strategies. Right? So in unknown environments, they will deploy, like the rat goes in the open space, will run around the walls, take more taxes first. Then there's a corner it will like the most, it will stop there more regularly, and then it starts to, from that position, veer out, and they have very systematic structures to explore. Billiard balls don't do that. Right? That's the big difference. That's how animals break that symmetry. So there are dedicated strategies, innate, in you, me, and the rat, to break these symmetries. It's a solved problem, at
Even for
least.
symmetrical.
Yeah, already. That was one of the first discoveries of evolution, to break that symmetry through exploratory strategies. Yeah. No problem. Okay.
Yes, the last one.
Okay, I'd like to ask you a question about action selection. Do you have some specific algorithm or process that drives your action selection?
Yeah.
Or what kind of, it's a kind of a subsumption or how it works?
Okay. Action selection happens at different layers in the system. Already in the episodic memory systems, you have like a software that they call. So it means the information that you move towards your decision-making stage already is undergoing some sort of filtering. Okay? So that's the first stage. Then it enters, let's say, the goal-oriented policy systems, and they also engage in a competition. And in that competition, 4 factors will play a role. What's the perceptual evidence? What's the goal I'm pursuing? What's my memory bias? Because if the world is predictable, you exploit your memory bias. And what's the value it's going to give me? Like, for instance, if I pursue a goal and I have 2 policies, but one is less energy than the other, okay, I go for the low energy one. So then you have a competition. If you want to map it to the brain, you look at cortical basal ganglia interactions that optimize across these factors. There's a very beautiful story, actually, already fairly old, that shows how, if you look at the control loops between cortex and basal ganglia, it really seems to cycle from, goal selection to memory selection to perception selection to action selection. Looping between cortex, basal ganglia, orchestrated supposedly by the dopaminergic system. It's something we're looking at right now. So this is then the way it will play out.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Keeping talking and discussion about that's the
Of course.
for mine. And
Yes.
maybe if you or in the discussion we can go back to the discussion after.
Absolutely, I'm here.
Okay,
That's something anytime.